Chapter 23, Section 4, Foreign Policy After the Cold War. What should the role of the U.S. be in the post-Cold War era? So the last 47 years of our foreign policy has pretty much been driven by the Cold War. So now for the first time in nearly 5 decades, we have to figure out something else to do. So we're going to look at reasons behind the use of force in some but not in others, and Persian Gulf War and its results, at least the first Persian Gulf War. So one of the things to really kind of pay attention to is, how history has a way of repeating itself, or past events, decisions kind of come back to impact us a little bit later on. If we look at Latin America and the war on drugs, at least since the Nixon years, we've kind of focused on the sellers and the users within the United States, and so we've criminalized drug use, which kind of begs the question: what if we addressed the suppliers in the first place? And if there was no supply, how would that impact the sellers and the users in the United States? So this is a multifaceted, very complicated. I don't mean to oversimplify it and say I have the solution, but there's lots of elements to this. Colombia and Panama are probably the biggest suppliers. The latest estimate is the United States spends somewhere between $40 and $50 billion a year to fight the war on drugs. That's a tremendous amount of money. I saw one estimate, and you don't know because I didn't double check it, but over the course of this war on drugs, we've spent nearly $51 trillion, and really we haven't made much of a dent in it. When you look at our federal and state prisons, half of all of our federal prisons have drug-related offenders in. It's a quarter of state prisons. And the most recent thing is heroin and prescription painkillers. That's the most recent drug that we're trying to fight and deal with. And so it kind of begs the question, if so many of these people are in prison related to selling or using drugs, and then we're going to have private for-profit prisons, those prisons are going to benefit from having more drug offenders in them because they make more money based on the number of people who are in there. So anyway, our criminal system and drugs and war on drugs probably continues to be an issue that needs to be debated and examined and trying to deal with. The other thing in the 1980s is China is cracking down. During the 1980s, you see a growing movement in China for China to open itself up to the West, to open itself up to information. And one of the things happens is that students and those people who want reform gather at Tiananmen Square. The government doesn't like this at all, and then there's this famous picture on the right of a college student or a professor standing in the way of these tanks. The government cracks down on this. The United States condemns it, and we suspend arms sales to China. We're trying to put some pressure on them, but President Bush, and probably rightfully so, doesn't believe that if we put any more sanctions on it, we're going to get much further, that we're better off working closely with China and nudging them in the direction of democracy rather than confront them and try and bring them down that way. The other thing that changes is South Africa. So South Africa had a system known as apartheid. Essentially, it was the same thing as the Jim Crow laws in the United States. They had a legal system that separated whites from Africans, white Africans from black Africans. And over the course of especially the late 70s, early 1980s, the world community really started to criticize South Africa and apartheid. And one of the most famous political prisoners is Nelson Mandela, and the government decides to release Nelson Mandela eventually. And one of the things that brings apart both the end of apartheid and the release of Nelson Mandela is that countries around the world were divesting in South Africa. In other words, they were pulling all of their investments, all of their businesses out, and were putting harsh economic sanctions on them to force them to join the rest of the world. And then what you get is you get a coalition government forming in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela gets elected president. The other thing is with the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of these former communist republics, it opens the door to some long simmering problems, and one of those is in Yugoslavia. Croatia and Serbia had long been enemies, and under the control of Yugoslavia and communism, they were able to kind of keep those ethnic and religious tensions bottled up. But once Yugoslavia falls, then it's opened for all of these old scores to be settled. And so we end up sending peacekeeping mission into this part of the world to try and prevent genocide and the war between these two places. The other place is Somalia. There is a civil war going on in Somalia. President Bush sends troops in there and aid in there through a United Nations peacekeeping effort called Restore Hope, and it's somewhat effective. The problem is, at the same time, similar things were happening in Rwanda, but we kind of turned our back on Rwanda, and so it's interesting how we pick and choose which of these places we do help out in and which of these places we don't. So when we look at the Persian Gulf War, the initial cause of it is that Saddam Hussein and Iraq invade Kuwait. The reason why is that would give Saddam control over 20% of the oil production in the world. The real issue for the United States, besides Saddam Hussein going in and taking over Kuwait, is that right next door is Saudi Arabia. And if he gains control of Saudi Arabia, he is essentially going to control almost all of the oil production in the world. And so the United States gets a coalition force brought together with countries from around the world. Places like Japan help fund it. Through the leadership of General Colin Powell and General Norman Schwarzkopf, we're able to turn this 5-week war in. We bomb them and we kill a number of their soldiers, and they end up having to surrender pretty quickly. One of the real concerns is he is firing missiles at U.S. forces and also at Israel, and the real danger here is that he is using chemical warfare because he had used chemical warfare against his own people. And so we're really concerned that that was something, and there were a number of Gulf War veterans who suffered all kinds of respiratory problems afterwards that were probably related to some of this chemical warfare. We eventually force Iraq out of Kuwait and he surrenders. And at that time, we opted not to topple Saddam Hussein, which is going to lead to 2001 and the United States eventually with the other Iraqi war. So again, these things kind of come back and renew themselves.